The reason that I decided to begin our instructional video here in this beautiful countryside is to demonstrate the evidence for muscle palpation. That's right, creation itself. Nature reveals that life is designed to overcome obstacles. The vertebral subluxation poses a threat to the entire system, and it's the muscles that are attempting to do something about that threat. Vertebral subluxation is unacceptable to the nervous system, and it uses the muscles. When we palpate the spine and find working muscles active over the segments of the spine, this is a battle that's going on, the muscles trying to fight the subluxation. See, we can't think of the vertebra as one stacked upon the other. We have to picture the spine as functionally integrated, as an entire complex. Therefore, when a vertebra misaligns from its natural position, it's at that point that the vertebra is a compromise, it's a threat to the system. It's an independent position or movement of the vertebra. You see, it's when a vertebra fails to move or position itself as a part of the whole, that's when it's acting independently, and that's when it becomes a threat to the nervous system. There are countless postures for the spine to acquire, and within any particular posture there's countless combinations for the vertebra to attain. There's not just one position or another that a vertebra acquires. It can acquire any particular position that the nervous system desires. It's the nervous system that assesses and governs the action of the individual vertebra in any particular posture, and it's the muscles that are the active players in this whole process. When one vertebra does not come to rest where it should within a particular posture, it's the muscles that go to work to try and bring the misalignment back to its intended position. See, the spine and the muscles are not separate. That's only found in anatomy textbooks and wall charts. The muscles are inherent to the spine. And what we're going to look at today is how the muscles work to fight the vertebral subluxation or to guard against it. We're going to see how the muscles give us all sorts of information about the vertebral subluxation. What we're going to cover today are areas such as the fundamental behavior of the muscles, some reasonable assumptions concerning muscle activity when it's responding to the vertebral subluxation, many of the misconceptions that others have made when trying to understand the muscles of the vertebral column. We're going to cover muscle location. We're going to cover practical demonstration of how you can start to find working muscles. And then we're going to demonstrate the unique pattern of activity within each listing so that you can actually use this form of analysis on Monday morning with each patient. The entity palpable tissue abnormality, which is considered to be an important component of the osteopathic lesion, is not new. It has been recognized as a part of abnormal body mechanics and of visceral disease for a long time. That was taken from the Journal of the American Osteopathic Association in April of 1951 by Dr. J.S. Denslow. Let's read another quote by Dr. Denslow in a paper called Reflex Activity in the Spinal Extensors. Quote, osteopaths and many orthopedic surgeons report the clinical finding of increased resistance to pressure deformation of the periarticular tissues of spinal, sacroiliac, and appendicular joints in certain cases which manifest neither obvious organic pathology nor voluntary muscle contraction. End quote. This reflex activity in the spinal extensors, as he relates it, is really a mystery in osteopathy as well as in chiropractic. In fact, it is related to the vertebral subluxation and what is called the osteopathic lesion, but in a way that we really don't understand. And I believe this is what's most exciting about muscle palpation, is the mystery involved. If we could again understand what the muscles were saying to us, we could get a lot of information. Mysteries are something that intrigue me, and I believe intrigue most people. Perhaps that's why the show Wheel of Fortune is captured so many people's attention. No one can really pass the TV screen without trying to solve that puzzle. In fact, it's somewhat of a mystery itself. Let's try to solve the mystery of reflex activity in the muscles that are associated with the vertebral subluxation. Let's look at a quote from Common Vertebral Joint Problems by Gregory Grieve to try to help us unlock this mystery of segmental muscular activity. Quote, the sternomastoid muscle on the side opposite to the tilt is often in some spasm, as if trying to correct it. Dr. Grieve is referring to the tilt of torticollis and the fact that the sternocleidomastoideus muscle appears to be trying to correct the torticollis, or the tilt. This is a surprise simply because we don't know the mechanism behind it. But that's one of the things we're going to be doing here, is trying to unlock this mystery and, in fact, take a journey to understand what the muscles of the spine are doing. Years ago, I saw an ad in one of our chiropractic publications that was a call for papers on the analysis of the vertebral subluxation. And so I responded and found out that the response that they had been getting from the field was virtually nil, that in fact no one had answered a call for papers or for presentations at the symposium on the analysis for the vertebral subluxation. And I just thought it spoke of the sad state of affairs in our profession concerning our lack of knowledge of the subluxation, but our lack of emphasis on analysis. Really, there's so many great chiropractic techniques out there, but very few that emphasize how we should be detecting the vertebral subluxation, and particularly when you're talking about visit-to-visit analysis. There are many credible forms of X-ray analysis now, particularly with the motion studies that are being done. But what I want to show here is what amounts to actually the most scientific gauge for the vertebral subluxation, the most reliable detector for the subluxation. It's a muscle spindle. We're going to be referring to it extensively in one of the other videotapes concerning the physiology of muscle palpation. But this gauge, or this detector, is built right into the system. It's the way that the body determines joint position. In the book Clinical Biomechanics of the Spine by White and Panjabi, they state, and I quote, "The spine with its ligaments intact but devoid of muscles is an extremely unstable structure. The muscles and complex neuromuscular controls are required to provide stability of the trunk in a given posture and to produce movements during physiologic activity. The muscles may also play a role in protecting the spine during trauma, in which there is time for voluntary control, and possibly in the post-injury phase." The protection of the central nervous system by osseous structures such as the vertebra and skull suggests its importance to the organism. It's no surprise then that the vertebrae are knit together by many tough ligamentous structures, as well as stabilized by hundreds of small muscles. The muscles which attach directly to the vertebral processes are stretch sensitive due to the inherent muscle spindles. The stretch reflex, in fact, is something that we're going to be talking about at length during our section on physiology. The result of stretching of the muscle spindle results in a command from the central nervous system to the muscle to contract. These muscles then, during the vertebral subluxation, we're going to try to build a case for the fact that they're actually trying to correct, making an attempt to correct the misalignment, or at least to splint it, pulling towards proper positioning of the joints. The most extensive research that has been done on segmental muscular activity was done by a group of osteopaths and published by Dr. Denslow in, again, the Journal of the American Osteopathic Association, in an article called An Approach to Skeletal Components in Health and Disease. This study stated that 80% of the time there was inter-examiner reliability when using simple palpation. Dr. Irvin Kaur, an osteopathic researcher and PhD, stated that he found Dr. Denslow to be able to predict electromyographic activity on a segmental level 95% of the time accurately. This is an incredible statistic, stating that with simple palpation, Dr. Denslow could find muscular activity, and it would be right in line with the electromyographic needle insertion that they were using at that time. What we were looking for can be described as resting segmental, reflex, paravertebral, muscular activity. That's a mouthful, but let's go over it step by step. Resting. These working muscles can be found while the patient's in the resting state, either supine or prone. This is what distinguishes
the working muscle from voluntary contraction, the fact that it occurs while the patient is recumbent. This is, of course, not the only thing that isolates or distinguishes the working muscle, but the fact that it's resting muscular activity does give us a lot of information. It's segmental. It occurs on 1 or 2 levels of the spine, as opposed to being a regional contraction or a gross muscular spasm. It's reflex in that it's involuntary. It occurs in the paravertebral muscles. It's working in particular, these muscles are working in particular patterns. We note the suboccipital and the transversospinal muscles reveal an organized effort by the system to splint the articulations. Of course, it's muscular. The muscles are the offensive weapons against the vertebral subluxation. And this activity is responsive to the dictates of the body. And again, we're going to show how it's linked to the nervous system. So let me repeat that. This muscular activity is resting segmental, reflex muscular activity. And this, again, distinguishes this type of activity from other types of muscular contraction. To understand the vertebral subluxation, it's necessary that we recognize the fact that there's such a thing as the non-subluxated or normal spine. This is, of course, working backwards. The normal spine should not be measured against the vertebral subluxation, but should be measured by an absolute functional as well as structural normal. So we need to begin to collect data. This is what chiropractic science should be doing. Collect data concerning the normal spine, the ligaments, the disc, the zygapophyseal joints, the foramen, all the normals associated with the spine, the normal ranges of motion. As the data begins to accumulate, we can take that information and apply it to our various techniques. This would, of course, enhance our techniques and make them work better, but more importantly, we would be able to make the vertebral subluxation more obvious if we could understand the normal spine. The vertebral subluxation, in all its manifestations, could then be systematically described and charted. But because the vertebral subluxation is not a state per se, but the lack of a normal state, we would be as hard-pressed as our medical colleagues who are concerned with disease to describe the vertebral subluxation, which in the same way is not something, but is the lack of normal function. So we'll never be able to say we've finally proven to the world that the vertebral subluxation is this or it's that. It's really the absence of normal which expresses itself in these various manifestations: misalignment, aberrant motion, histochemical and physiologic changes, nerve irritation, loss of the natural curves, articular fixation and degeneration, myofascial imbalance, etc., etc. Therefore, our various techniques which approach the subluxation from these various manifestations are just exploiting the different handles with which you can unlock the spine. Make no mistake about it, though. We are not correcting the subluxation. It's the patient's own body that does the correction. This is one of the primary premises of advanced muscle palpation. We initiate the correction, but it's the patient's inborn intelligence which corrects the spine. You have to believe that there's an inborn design for normal. Normal is what is normal for that particular patient at any particular moment in time. It's not our duty to determine normal for them. We should apply our present knowledge of normal to our technique, but we cannot create a normal spine. We can merely hope to unlock it from the subluxation. Advanced muscle palpation assumes that the patient's body knows what's normal for their spine. Our goal is to cooperate with what the patient's spine is already trying to do, what the patient's body is already trying to do with that spine, and just cooperate with that. Advanced muscle palpation recognizes the inborn intelligence of the body as the master coordinator. And in advanced muscle palpation, we state that if you could understand what the muscles of the spine were doing to encourage correction of the vertebral subluxation or to stabilize the zygapophyseal joints, then you could take advantage of that information and make a better adjustment, a gentler, a kinder chiropractic adjustment. Most of the research regarding the muscles of the spine has been done concerning their involvement in the scoliosis, and it's been done by medical researchers because honestly, chiropractors have not done very much research, and particularly where it concerns the muscles of the spine. So we have to take this information and see what it can show us about the muscles and their involvement in the subluxation, or if in fact this research can give us any information at all. If you recall, while you were in chiropractic college, one of the tenets of muscular involvement in the scoliosis was that the muscles were pulling the spine out of balance, much the same way that most chiropractors view the subluxation and the muscular involvement there. They recognize, or they believe they recognize, that the muscles are the bad guy. They're the ones that are causing the misalignment. They're the ones that are causing the scoliosis. Well, this was also thought to be the case by the medical researchers as well, until some legitimate research was done on the subject. So we're going to take a look at some of that research right now and see how those muscles are involved in the scoliosis. And again, maybe we can make take some general principles from this information in regards to the muscles' involvement in the subluxation. So if you'll turn in your manuals to the section titled Muscular Insight from the Scoliosis, we'll read some of these quotes together and get an understanding of where the research has gone concerning muscles of the spine. The muscles of the spine, as stated here, are exquisitely orchestrated to act on the vertebral column to adapt it to its environment. These muscles are, in fact, a positive influence on the spine, and when the muscles fail regarding the scoliosis, it is not the muscles that are causing the scoliosis. Now, if this sounds radical or revolutionary to your concepts of the muscles, then I really encourage you to read this section and these quotes, perhaps get the original articles, and see what the data is saying. Again, and then we can transpose this information perhaps on the subluxation. If we look at the quote by Hatterspeck, our very first quote, he in fact is stating that the problem in the muscles, or the problem with the scoliosis in fact, is in the motor control system. It's in the proprioceptive system. It's not in the muscles of the spine. They do not cause the curvature. It's the neural mechanisms that are lacking. And of course, in chiropractic, we automatically would assume that this could be the vertebral subluxation that causes this nerve interference or this improper proprioceptive control. But before we jump to any conclusions, let's continue to read on. Okay, our next quote by Ruber states that when the motor control system fails to provide appropriate amounts of lateral asymmetry in muscle contraction forces, the intervertebral discs within the lateral curve are subjected to nearly constant moments tending to tilt them further laterally, so to increase the scoliosis curve. What's Ruber saying to us? He's stating that it's the muscles that are unable to pull the spine back toward normal. They need to be more asymmetrical. We look at the asymmetry again, and we often say that those muscles that are contracted or more active are pulling the spine out of place. Ruber stating that those muscles need to be more active to allow the spine to balance itself. The cause is not in the muscles again, it's in the neural control system. All right, let's go to our next quote by Ruber that states that scoliosis progression seems not to be caused by asymmetry to muscle contractions, rather it may be caused by a lack of adequate asymmetry. Again, to halt progression of the scoliosis, muscles on the side of the convexity must be used. This is the conclusion of his biomechanical study. There's not enough muscle contraction to stop the scoliosis. There's obvious increased tonic contraction on the side of the convexity. That's what all these researchers are saying to us. And we're going to read on in a few minutes. But let's just take a look at that. On the side of the convexity, the side of the scoliosis curve, the high side of the rainbow, as the Gonstead people would state. There is increased activity in the muscles. Is this what's causing the scoliosis? Our researchers come to the conclusion that no, it's not. And if we would just take a logical look at the fact that they find more electromyographic activity on that side of the spine, it would be obvious to us that those muscles are trying to balance, or perhaps you could say trying to correct the scoliosis. We're going to see that's not completely the case, but that's the basic idea, and we'll take a further look at that in a minute. The histochemical studies show that there's apparent convex muscular activity occurring. The ultrastructural studies that take a look at the small fibers of the spine and determine what has occurred, which fibers have been overused or maladapted, shows that there's more activity on the side of the convexity. The biomechanical or computer studies, the motion studies, and the electromyographic studies all determine that there's more activity on the side of the convexity. And again, this should be radical to you if your concept of the scoliosis has been that the muscles cause the scoliosis. If we take a look at Ruber's study again, he gives us more or less an example of what you would expect to find in the electromyographic evaluation of the spine if there was a certain progression of the curvature. He predicts what type of muscular activity would be occurring on the side of the convexity if the muscles were in fact trying to balance that spine. And first of all, he shows that the contractions associated with the scoliosis, again, are necessary. They're not causative. If you look here at the first part of the quote, he says there's a 1 centimeter apical offset. The apex of the curvature has shifted 1 centimeter. In order to stop the shift of that apex any further, the muscles on the side of the convexity have to be activated. He quantifies the weight value above the apex of the curve and how this is going to mechanically alter the curve and continue to increase it. So if he shows you that the curve has offset to a certain degree and that there's a certain amount of weight that continues to cause it to progress, he can now predict biomechanically how much activity should be occurring on the side of the convexity. And this is just what he goes about doing. And then he shows us electromyographically that this is actually what does take place in the spine. He predicts the correct values of what we find in the spine on the electromyographs when we test the scoliosis in the living patient. At rest, normal muscle activity virtually ceases in the erect spine. That's because the muscles of the spine are not designed for weight bearing. Posture is maintained mostly by the ligaments of the spine and the osseous structures, and of course the discs, the cartilage. But the muscles add very little to the erect posture. This is very important. An erect or an equilibrated posture does not depend on muscular activity except in the scoliosis. The scoliosis demands that more activity take place to balance that person in the erect posture. Because the spine was not designed for that sort of posture, the muscles have to balance it. The quote we have here by Hatterspeck states that the trunk muscles do have the inherent ability to correct the lateral spine curves, but natural neural signals directing them to do so apparently are deficient. Again, this should tell us that these muscles are not the bad guys. This is the bottom line. The muscles are working harder on the side of the convexity because they don't want the scoliosis to fall over on itself or the spine to fall over on itself. That may sound simplistic, but that is essentially what's happening. They're maintaining the upright posture and not allowing the offset to continue. But as Hatterspeck states here, they have the ability to actually correct the scoliosis. It's inherent in the muscles to be able to pull that spine upright. So there's something else happening here that's not allowing the spine to naturally correct or to come back to its A to P normal. As Portnoy has stated here, stretch may might have an important role in causing this muscular activity. Again, we go back to the stretch receptors, to the muscle spindles. Stretch may be the activating factor. Let's read our quote. Apparently minor displacements of the center of gravity are responsible for these variations. Our observations show that the sacrospinalis responds promptly to these slight changes in the center of gravity. Stretch is the governing mechanism. Let's go on. The discordant reports on the constancy of function of postural muscles in the standing at ease position can probably be explained on this basis. And he goes on to state that very little lengthening the muscles takes place, but in fact that small amount of lengthening or stretch is probably the activating factor. Stretch is the mechanism that activates the muscles on the convex side of the curve. Now let's go to an older quote by this fellow Zook, Z-U-K. He found greater electrical activity on the side of the convexity, and he makes, again, what we call here some startling assertions. It is therefore concluded that the amplitude and frequency of potentials reflect the strain to which a muscle is subjected rather than the amount of work it performs. In other words, a weak muscle lifting a certain load will show greater electrical activity than a strong muscle lifting a bigger load. It is suggested that the increased electrical activity is therefore a sign that a muscle is reaching the limit of its power, and may be a sign of weakness rather than strength, because strong muscles will need to use only a few of their fibers to perform a given task, but weak muscles will have to use more of their fibers, and the contractions will have to be more frequent. In other words, greater electrical activity in muscles on the convex side in scoliosis does not prove that these muscles are stronger unless the conditions under which they are working are taken into consideration. It is concluded that the development of scoliosis is due to muscle imbalance, the weaker muscles being on the convex side of the curve. It is suggested that the increased electrical activity in the muscles on the convex side is secondary to the scoliosis, being a part of the body's attempt to compensate for the curvature. This sounds a lot like advanced muscle palpation on a larger scale. We're going to see there's some very big differences. But what we can see here is that you can trust the muscular activity in the scoliosis. That's essentially the same thing we're saying in muscle palpation, that the muscles are trying to balance the spine. The essential differences we're going to point out in a minute. But the muscles of the spine are a defense mechanism, at the very least, for proper posture and proper alignment and juxtaposition. But somehow, it's not the goal of the nervous system to correct the scoliosis. If it were, Hatterspeck states that the muscles have the ability to do that. We're going to see that the curvatures begin and then continue to progress without adequate neural feedback to halt that progression. Perhaps again there's nerve interference there in one form or another, perhaps from the subluxation. And there's clinical evidence that points to the subluxation. We'll look at that again in a minute. Our goal here, though, is not to try to unlock the mystery of the cause of the subluxation, but unlock the mystery of what these muscles are doing in the spine. So we'll take a quick look at the causative factors in a minute. But let's just continue to look here at our quotes by Dupuis as he describes the structures of the spine as stabilizers, and then he categorizes them as passive stabilizers, dynamic stabilizers, active stabilizers, and hydrodynamic stabilizers. Of course, hydrodynamic, we hear the